call the honourable member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair, and I'm very happy to take a brief call on the Crown Minerals Amendment Act of 2013 Amendment Bill. Actually, hang on, let me just get this right. This is the Crown Minerals Amendment Act 2013 Amendment Bill. So if I'm correct, this is a bill amending an act that hasn't yet come into force.
That's right.
So and how did we get to this state of being where we are here under urgency amending a piece of legislation that hasn't even yet come into force? Could it be? Well, that's right, yeah, that's right. This one could be passed before the other one even comes into force. Could it be that the government made a critical mistake when they introduced that last piece of legislation? They made the critical mistake, they put Simon Bridges in charge of it. They put Simon Bridges in charge of it, and he decided that he was going to make some changes, and he wasn't going to allow anybody to have a say on those changes that he was going to make. He was going to introduce them by way of a supplementary order paper after it had been through the select committee process, without any chance to give those adequate scrutiny. But that's okay, because according to the National Party, that's all a bit of an option these days, whether you actually ask people whether they actually agree with anything, or whether maybe they could improve legislation. That's all just optional these days with the National Party, so they didn't bother with that. And what do you know? Before the legislation is even in force, they're back here amending it, because they stuffed it up. Because they completely stuffed it up. They left Simon Bridges in charge, his first piece of legislation in the House, I think, and he managed to completely stuff it up. I bet he's popular with his cabinet colleagues, because the very first thing he did was introduce a piece of legislation, take it through the House with amendments, and then within weeks he's taking up more House time to fix his stuff-ups. I bet that makes him really, really popular. Urgency on a Friday night, I bet that makes him really popular. But, Mr Speaker, oil and gas exploration is something that people do talk about in New Zealand, and the people that come up to me in my electorate to talk about it, they'll say, yep, those who are in favour of it, even those who are in favour of it, the first question they will ask is it safe? So even if they're in favour and they say, yep, we should go out there, if we've got oil there, we should drill it, these are the people who are even in favour of it, the first question they will ask is it safe? And they look at some of the experiences from offshore, things like the Gulf of Mexico, you know, which focused everybody's minds on the risks involved in deep-sea oil drilling, and so they want to know, if we're going to be doing it here, have we got safeguards in place to ensure that that sort of thing would not happen in New Zealand? And I think New Zealanders' minds were focused on that even more when a separate issue occurred with the RENA and with the clean-up that was required. From a fraction of the amount of oil that came off the RENA to what might come out of a deep-sea oil well when something went wrong. Fraction of the amount of oil from the RENA, and we could have a lot more than that if something went wrong with deep-sea oil drilling. So people simply want to know, if we're going to do it, is it safe? And if, even despite all of the safety precautions that might be put in place, if something were to go wrong, could we remediate it quickly? Because New Zealand's worst nightmare, the worst nightmare of all New Zealanders, would be a Gulf of Mexico-like disaster with oil continually gushing for weeks and weeks and weeks without the ability to stop it. And think of the damage that would do to New Zealand. Our tourism industry would be down the drain overnight. One of the biggest industries in New Zealand, one that we rely on, it's our bread and butter, we rely on it to make our living as a country, and yet a massive oil spill would overnight wipe out our tourism industry because of the damage it would do to our clean green economy. A lot of our primary exporting industries also rely on our clean green image for the access to overseas markets. So when people ask, is it safe? They've got really, really good reasons for doing so, because of the considerable damage it would do to New Zealanders, the New Zealand environment, the New Zealand economy and New Zealanders' way of life if something went wrong, should deep-sea oil drilling happen in New Zealand in the future. So that's the first question that people ask, and it is the right question to ask. So consider now that So consider that now in the context of this particular piece of legislation and in the context in which it is brought into the House. So the legislation, as I mentioned, is the bill that we are now debating is fixing up mistakes that were made in the original piece of legislation yet to come into force because it was rushed through and because it didn't get appropriate scrutiny, Now, I've said this before in the House once already in this urgency debate, because this is not the first bill that we are debating under urgency, Mr Chair. Mr Chair.
Chris Hipkin.
Thank you, Mr Chair. This is not the first bill that we are debating under in this particular urgency motion that has not been referred to a select committee. But I said in the debate on the earlier bill that I have not participated in any select committee hearing around a bill where the bill hasn't been improved in some way by comments made either by a council, by advisors, and often by the public, who pick things up that those who are dealing with the matter all day, every day, perhaps lose sight of. That's one of the reasons why we have a select committee process, because this Parliament is made up of people, we're lay people, I guess, in the Parliament. You know, we're not all subject matter experts in absolutely everything that goes on here, so we allow the people who are the chance to scrutinise what it is that we are doing in the House. It's a really critical part of our democratic process and a part of our constitutional arrangements. I don't know a heck of a lot about oil and gas exploration. I did work in the oil and gas industry for about a year and a half. I wasn't actually doing the practical hands-on stuff. I was coordinating training for the people who were. And it was a huge eye-opener for me. I learned a lot about the oil and gas industry, but I would never for 1 second purport to be an expert on the matters that are covered by this bill and by this legislation. So therefore, as a parliamentarian, to do my job effectively, I need the chance to hear from the people who are. The other way we do that in this House is we have a thing called a regulatory impact statement. And that is where, again, independent experts check over legislation to make sure that the legislation before the House does what it says it's supposed to do. And that the government, in deciding what legislation to bring before the House, have chosen the best of the options available to achieve the desired outcome. So what's the regulatory impact statement for this bill? We don't have one. The regulatory impact statement that they are relying on for this piece of legislation is the same regulatory impact statement that they had for the first lot of legislation that they completely stuffed up. So the best advice that we have here under urgency is the advice we got when the House stuffed it up in the first place, because Simon Bridges is too lazy to make sure that we actually get better advice, and that we're not going to be back here again in a few weeks because he's stuffed it up a second time. So it is vitally important that we work through these processes carefully, because there is a heck of a lot at stake. And every New Zealander is entitled to know, if we are going to be doing deep sea drilling in New Zealand, that it's going to be safe, that there are appropriate checks and balances in place, and yes, that there are contingencies there so that should something go dramatically wrong, that steps can be taken to address the damage, minimise the damage before it gets completely out of hand. We've seen the Gulf of Mexico. We've seen what happens when things go wrong. Mr. Speaker, the Labour Party does in fact support exploration in New Zealand. We do see the value of the minerals that we have here. And I can see Gareth Hughes. I'm sure Gareth's got something to say about that, and I'm sure that he'll be speaking very shortly in the debate. We do. But we want to know that there are appropriate safety measures in place. And we want to know that decisions are being made judiciously and following appropriate processes, because that may sound a bit bureaucratic to say following appropriate processes, but in a country like ours, a small country like ours, with a simple governing structure like ours, where there aren't a huge number of checks and balances in our legislative process, at least if we make sure that we are following a democratic process, we minimise the risk of things going wrong. We don't have an upper house. So in many other countries, if a bill like this was introduced through Parliament and passed under urgency, it would then be subject by scrutiny from another legislative body. We don't have that in New Zealand. Once it gets passed by the Parliament, it then gets the royal assent, normally within a few days, and it's the law. That's it. It can't be struck down by the court, because we don't have a written constitution under which gives the court the powers to strike down laws in New Zealand, as many other countries would do. Therefore, it is incumbent on all of us as parliamentarians to make sure the decisions we make in the House are robust. And in order to do that, we've got a series of processes that this government, time and time again, have proven that they are willing to completely ignore and ride roughshod over. This, I'm sad to say, is a return to the sort of practice we saw so much in the last Parliament, where urgency was used to circumvent the democratic process, and it is wrong.
I call the Honourable Member Sue Moroney.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and thank you for allowing me to take a call on the